art education, as mentioned by Dr. Rafia Tahir, or design practice and educational system highlighted by Dr. Ufakinam yesterday in panel 1B's discussion. So the prevalence of neo-colonial practices, even after the apparently ended colonialism, led to the boom of decolonial practices in native communities. And in this age of artificial intelligence, we are confronting such things. Expanding its sphere, this upsurge further caused an urge for indigeneity among post-colonial nations in the initial decades of 21st century that eventually found its exemplification in indigenous futurism. Indigenous futurism and a native slipstream are the theoretical lens for this study, and Grace Dillon, an associate professor in Indigenous Nation Studies program at Portland State University, has coined and theorized the term Indigenous futurism, and he further segmented it into native slipstream in the first ever anthology of Indigenous science fiction, Walking the Clouds, in 2012. Dillon defines indigenous futurism as an experiment of thought that places natives in a futuristic setting to refine 21st century sensibility about them through the inclusion of their own cultural practices. So, indigenous futurism was initially a concept, as theorized by Dillon. However, now it has turned into a movement as it reverberates Afrofuturism, which is also a movement initiated by the African activists, musicians, and artists and the writers to imagine untrammeled black subjectivity in alternative worlds that can firmly be traced back in the last decades of the 20th century. So, nevertheless, indigenous futurism is not restricted to African or any particular culture or community. Rather, it can be adopted by any nation through the course of science fiction to imagine an indigenous future. Similarly, as one of the superseding constructs of indigenous futurism, native slipstream views time as pasts and presents and futures that flow together like runs in a navigable term. It thus replicates the non-linear thinking of indigenous futurism, including about space and time, but specifically about indigenous concepts. Before delving into the analysis of artworks, I find it essential to scrutinize the criteria of being indigenous in any community, as native and indigenous are the key terms that contribute to the overall comprehension of my study. So the definitions provided by Amnesty International, ILO, World Bank categorize indigenous people as the descendants of the inhabitants who lived in particular territories at the time of the establishment or the conquest of that country. They follow their own traditions, political process, legal system, and economic resources apart from the mainstream system of culture. So they are the marginalized and discriminated ones, and they are discriminated by the state for not allowing their regulations, for not following their regulations. So accordingly, this shared definition permits very less citizens of the state to be known as indigenous. Hence, indigenous peoples represent, as according to the statistics given by these international organizations, they almost represent 5% of the world population, and 70% of them live in Asia. So, however, there can be many indigenous groups within one state due to the different cultures as per province and region. Similarly, if you look at in the context of Pakistan, this criterion excludes many of our citizens from the status of being indigenous if we analyze them in the definition given by the international organizations. However, United Nation is the one that has given right of self-identification rather than defining indigenous peoples according to the rubrics of Human Rights Declaration. So this significance and the applicability of the defined features of indigenous is basically based on the context and the situation of each state as the limitations posed by international organizations on position of natives or indigenous in the similar country are hard to be practiced for each country. So, as per right of defining indigenous given by United Nations, in the context of the study, indigenous peoples are the ones who are the descendants of the inhabitants of those who have been living since the establishment of Pakistan. Now I move forward to the analysis. And this analysis basically encapsulates Pakistani speculative art, which is classified into two major sections for this study. The first section is to analyze the revival of the cultural heritage, dependency of AI on humans, gradual downfall of AI, and it offers a critique of the social dilemmas and AI-dominated future in Umar Gilani's digital speculative art. And the second part of the section of the study examines geometry of the spirit with reference to Islamic metaphysics and mysticism, artistic paradigm of Islamic cosmology, and calligraphic critique of modernity in the Zwanul Haq's semi-sci-fi calligraphy. So this is the first one, and this is the first section that basically traces the revival of cultural heritage and customs in Umar Gilani's digital art. Due to the time crunch, I would briefly explain one of the art pieces. You may see other ones as they are depicted there in the slides. In the first digital painting, the in figure 1, there is a local chai dhaba, which is somehow affected by the high-tech development as robot is taking the tea tray to serve tea among the seated ones. Nevertheless, the indigenous way of taking tea at dhaba while talking with other village fellows in terms of bathak is still present. So, as we can observe that the owner of the dhaba, a human is making the tea, and the humans are sitting and gossiping with each other, whereas the robot is restricted to the subservient role as a waiter to serve the tea and cater the needs of the humans who would still be able to sit and talk, keeping the indigenous multidisciplinary interaction intact, and continue to raise the question of why in a conversational setting of public space in future to basically reject the robotic demand of change in cultural norms and policy and to have a decisive impact on narrative of global culture. So I am now moving forward to the next slide, which is basically a critique of the social dilemmas. So in the figure 4, we see that a guy is bargaining with the rickshaw driver in the inner city, and a rickshaw, and a truck are flying. This is something which depict Pakistan's technological advancement with reference to flying traffic, but at the same time, it represents Pakistani culture of rickshaw, and it manifests here, and the traditional costumes the boy is wearing. Apart from that, the theme of class divide is quite manifest here because the two cars are flying at somewhat higher altitude. However, the auto rickshaw, a low-priced source of travel for the poor people, is comparatively closer to the ground. Moreover, a utility store is also visible in the background in the image that is introduced by the government for subsidized offerings for the weaker segment of society. So such debates provoked by art also create an awareness mechanism through a complicated and often repressive post-colonial landscape. And afterwards, we have through these artistic productions, Gilani basically wants to show the dependency of
Rafa, you
artificial
have to wind up soon. Your time's up. You will have to wind up in another couple of minutes.
Okay, sir. Okay, sir. I'm just skipping these slides. And now moving forward to the second section of my study. And in this we see that the artwork encapsulates the calligraphic demonstration of the metaphysical reality. And this is figure 11. It questions the dual nature of reality, as sometimes what eye captures may not exist in actual, as these can be mere evanescent glimpses. Thus, the observation of these art pieces creates a visual illusion and confuses the brain. So Rizwan draws our attention toward the significance of what soul feels, as soul can peel off the layers of the transnatural receptivity. And similarly, his calligraphy is a depiction of the heart and soul relationship there, and that eventually drenches humanity into the ink of the paint. Afterwards, in figure 14, here Rizwan captures the scene from another world to show the artistic paradigm of Islamic cosmology. Here Rizwan uses slipstream's artistic device to speculate a fantastic world. He constructs his imaginary world with Quranic verses to portray a native Islamic version of future by crossing the conventional boundaries of art. Along with Rizwan promotes Islam's encouragement to explore the other horizons of the universe and wonder they contain, as it is mentioned in Surah Al Imran, that indeed in the creation of heavens and earth and the alteration of night and day, there are signs for those of understanding. Hence, the silence of the unfamiliar region marks the unmapped openness with an indigenous religious style. I'm just moving to the conclusion. So, conclusively, Gilani's inspection of contemporary socio-ecological, econo-political, and religio-historical concerns, and Razvan's critique of monistic philosophy and technological inventions with the touch of Islamic mysticism, spiritualism, actually redefine the purpose of art, not just as the source of aesthetic pleasure, but also the portrayal of social dilemmas to ponder over them. This artistic take of Gilani and Rizwan can be read as an artistic resistance, which goes against the mainstream neonic trends and tropes to pave the way for a better future by not just reviving the historical cultural traditions of the past, but also examining the contemporary concerns in present to imagine an indigenous future. And so this study emphasizes the need to further develop and conduct an interdisciplinary research on the emerging trends in indigenous futurism and Pakistani literary artistic productions. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you very much, Zafra, and it was such an amazing paper, and thank you very much. I'm already familiar with your work since we are trying to focus on digital humanities from, of course, the indigenous perspective and what sort of digital art is being created where old forms are merged with the new. So kindly pay my regards to this, I'm sure, beautiful sparrow, or I don't know which bird it is, which gave you that background sound, and we thoroughly enjoyed it. You are lucky to be living close to birds. So with this, we move on to, I can see that Faiza Anam is there, and the topic of her paper is Science, Literature, of course, from bits which are there in IT, bits of data. So it's Science, Literature, and Literary Futurology, an interdiscursive reading of Nadine Gordimer's Get a Life. So over to you, Faiza.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody, and good morning. I'm indeed honored to share this virtual space with Dr. SHAHZEB Khan, who's a panel chair today. However, he's my mentor since 2013. In specific, the paper that I'll present today, it springs out of the tree that Dr. SHAHZEB planted into our cognition during our course on Brecht's Life of Galileo, basically. So to move on from this pertinent preamble, my paper attempts to undo this popular belief that literary pieces are divorced from material sciences like biology, virology, physics, and so on and so forth. These two cultures, science and literature, as per the cliche, are apparently incompatible. However, if we look closely at the dimension of these two disciplines, some of the shared grounds that we find in literature and science, they are pretty intriguing. I'll quote some of the references here. For example, the recurrent theme that we have in sciences, basically, that is about human existence, life's big questions, that why am I here and how did I get there, Big Bang Theory and all that. And if you look closely, all these questions that are being explored by different sciences, the same questions are there that are being explored by literary scientists. In literary texts, we see both in ancient literary texts and in contemporary literary texts as well, writers are sort of preoccupied with the same dimension of human existence and human evolution, and of course, human survival as well. So this sort of gives the impetus to this paper that I'm going to present. So such, shared grounds between literature and science, they need to be explored. And thus to explain these shared grounds for literature and science, it is especially in the 19th century that we observe that interest in literature and science has developed into a vibrant mainstream sub-discipline of the history of science and simultaneously of literary studies. Since then, an efflorescence of studies on the relationship between science and literature is witnessed. This recent development in literary studies predominantly assumes two major perspectives. First is the tendency to assume that the traffic flowed from science to literature, therefore scientific material being the source is imbibed, tried and tested in literary laboratories by men of letters. Second perception is that, literature is the source for the production of scientific knowledge. However, there is this urgency of a working model of two-way traffic in which science and literature, as defined by historical actors, borrow continuously from each other. That's inevitable. So basically, drawing on this proposition of a two-way traffic, this working model of two-way traffic about the interface between science and literature, I have explored Nadine Gordimer's relatively less popular novel, Get a Life, that was published in 2005. Upon its publication, it did not get very positive reviews as compared to other works by Nadine Gordimer. She's a short story writer as well. She's known more for her short fiction and long fiction as well. But Get a Life is a relatively, not well-received piece. And there were a couple of reasons that critics have cited for it being, a book that is not intriguing. Some of the critics call it an irritating piece as well. And that is primarily because of, in my observation, it's because of this impregnation of the literary jargon with the scientific diction, as the book deals with the protagonist's battle with radioactive therapy and the way, he becomes a threat for the humanity as well eventually. So I think this interplay between scientific discourse and literary discourse is what, might have made critics to conclude that Get a Life has a very irritating sort of addiction. It has a very irritating sort of a discourse and narrative style as well. So in doing so, in light of Peter Swirsky, who also provides the theoretical impetus of this research, and he claims that literature has the potential to form cognition. Literature can act, it can think, so ultimately it can propose some solutions like other sciences can. In this paper, I'll explore Get a Life as a fictional thought experiment. So I believe that every literary piece is a fictional thought experiment, but in different dimensions. And why I feel that Get a Life is a fictional thought experiment is because of this dialogue, this interdiscursive dialogue between scientific discourse and literary discourse that eventually ends up churning hypotheses about current and forthcoming realities. And the reality that I'm going to hint on is basically COVID-19, because of which we're having in this particular virtual conference, pros and cons both. So some of the questions that I'll be dealing in my research are: how does Get a Life accommodate discussion of pure scientific discourse? And what effects does the insertion of special discourse have on the linguistic web of the novel? So I will be referring to scientific discourse as special discourse, as it's not literary, or at least something more than literary. Moreover, does Get a Life as a textual space inhibit cognitive potential to propose hypotheses and thought experiments like science? So these hypotheses may prove right in future. They may be debunked. Eventually, that's what the time is going to tell. So these are two of the questions that I'll try to address, keeping in mind the time constraints that we have. And I think I've already mentioned Peter Sawarsky, who provides the theoretical impetus for my research. There's this popular book by him called Between Literature and Science that was published in 2000. And he argues, as I've already said, that literature thinks and acts in a manner comparable to human sciences. So that's where he gives this edge to literature, that it can be a source of potential hypotheses, like other sciences propose these hypotheses that we rely on and we believe in. Literature thus has the potential to play the much needed role of a cultural data bank and a narrative modeling laboratory, where the thought experiment about the effects of an uncommon disease upon humans and other living beings are measured with objective detachment. That's another keyword that I've used. This is how I've sort of tried to rebuttal the claim of critics about Get a Life that the narration is not irritating. Rather, I think Gadamer has managed to maintain this sense of objective detachment as a narrator, and that was sort of needed to convey a source that is equally scientific and literary as well, because it does talk about the crisis of human existence. This book is very much about the crisis of an individual and the way that individual is going to exist after becoming an untouchable threat, a leaper for the rest of the human beings and even inanimate objects as well. Therefore, literary fiction can be futurological. Now, that's not a term that Sawarsky basically uses. Literary futurology is sort of a neologism, maybe. So what I mean by literary futurology is not that writers have this capacity to predict. However, the argument is that literary texts can be can produce hypotheses that may help humans in dealing with current realities or forthcoming realities. So this forthcoming reality, as this book was published in 2005, and of course I read it 3-4 years back, but it was during this phase of COVID-19 when the entire social geography had transformed all of a sudden. I had to reread the book, and it was during this rereading process that I reached this conclusion that this book actually has the potential of this futurological potential is there in this particular text. So this is what we're going to discuss, and for the analysis part, I will be pulling out a few textual references from Get a Life, and I'll analyze a few of them. The first one is from the very beginning of the book, and that's about describing the state of Paul Benjamin, the protagonist. And I quote, he's defined as radiant. It's just a one-word sentence. And Get a Life is full of these, sort of experimentation where you find one-word sentences, where you find random line breaks, usage of a lot of dashes as well. So in terms of the linguistic pattern, the book is diverse. And my argument in this particular perception is that it's diverse because the book is sort of juggling with literary and scientific discourse simultaneously. So this is how the writer has described Paul Benjamin's state, and it's in the very beginning of the book that we are introduced to the present state of Paul Benjamin, where he has been diagnosed with thyroid cancer, and he had to undergo a radioactive treatment. And as a result of that radioactive treatment, instead of finding a cure for that, he ends up, becoming radioactive himself. And ultimately, he turns into a threat for his fellows, families, and even inanimate objects, because whosoever is going to touch, he's going to transmit that radiation into that object to humans. And thus, he was quarantined. This word quarantine, you get to hear this word every 2 minutes when you give a read to this particular book. And I think way back in 2005, that was not a very common word, but now, of course, it is. All of us know about it. This is sort of another hint to why this book is futurological. So Paul Benjamin is described as radiant, literally radiant, but not giving off light as saints are shown with a halo. He radiates unseen danger to others from a destructive substance that has been directed to counter what was destroying him, had him by the throat, cancer of the thyroid gland. In hospital, he was...
Sorry for this interruption.
Yes.
If your time's up, please take 2 minutes to wind up.
Okay. So in the hospital, he was kept in isolation, even that of silence. He had no voice for a while. He was mute and listless. But there's just one last point that I'd like to make as the time is running out, which is that in the beginning, Paul had this serious reservations against the sense of being quarantined, where he was put in a garden in his mother's house. But eventually, he adjusts to this new normalcy. By the end of the book, he is able to reevaluate his life during that hiatus that was given to him by that particular disease. And he's been able to reevaluate his life, his relationships, thoughts about his professional life as well. And eventually you find that he gels well with this new normal state of being a leaper, being an untouchable, being in quarantine. And this is what I've basically argued in this book, that the text has this, potential to maybe show some of the hypotheses related to current and forthcoming realities. And it does relate sort of, with this current crisis of COVID-19. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Faiza, for this very insightful paper, and best of luck with your project. Is it your PhD thesis now, or your PhD proposal or something?
Not really. I don't know. As I told you, I had reread it. I read the book once, I think back in 2016 somewhere, 15, 16. But of course, I had different observations about the book already, but I was pretty intrigued by the sort of the content that was. I hope you remember I had my master's dissertation on Gaudimer, but that was on a short story collection. So I'm still reading Gaudimer, sort of. So I reread it during the quarantine times, and I just wrote this paper. And it was a fit for the conference. I thought, okay, let's send it out.
I'm sure there will be some questions regarding your paper towards the end. We'll take questions and comments, and we'll have some time for discussion. And with this, I hope Azka is settled, because I could see that she left the meeting for a while. Azka, are you with us? No, I think she's facing some trouble with her connection, so we'll wait for her. And in the meanwhile, since Dr. Waqar Azim is sitting so seriously, I don't know why. So let's move on to him. And it's indeed an honor for this panel that Dr. Waqar Azim is here, and he has done some excellent work. What has happened to my speaker? Anyway, so Dr. Waqar Azim's paper is on drones, human rights, and new critical practices. I know that he's working with, he did his PhD from New York University. Am I right, Waqar?
Yeah, so this is State University of New York.
State University of New York on a Fulbright scholarship. So over to you, Waqar.
Okay. Thank you so much. Of course, we have had not many discussions on similar topics. So basically, this is, a larger project, and I'm experimenting with a few thoughts. Right. Yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for giving this opportunity to me. So I look forward to your comments. So so this is a larger project, and I'm experimenting with the thought. So let's see where it goes. But I do look forward to the comments from you people. Okay, so I title it as Drones, Human Rights, and New Critical Practices. I don't have any slides to share. This is a written draft of the paper. roughly 5 pages. Okay, and I think I should finish in 10 minutes. So historically, the US drone program began in October 2001, ostensibly with the aim to kill Osama bin Laden and other Islamic terrorists in Afghanistan. Since then, the use of weaponized drones has been on rise, spreading to Pakistan, Yemen, Somalia, the Philippines, Libya, and Iraq. Defenders of the drone program insist on the humaneness of drone strikes, citing their supposed capacity for minimizing collateral damage. However, many human rights groups, including the Reprieve, Drone Wars UK, and Amnesty International, have persistently denounced these strikes as a violation of the human rights of the people subjected to the surveillance and assassination by the drone program. In addition, many legal experts have advocated the rights of the people impacted by drone strikes, pointing out how these strikes breach the right to privacy and upend the right to life. Focusing on the cultural representation of drones, this paper proposes a critical and theoretical perspective on the controversial relationship between human rights and weaponized drones. I anticipate that a cultural critique of relevant literary and artistic texts can expose various human rights violations associated with the drone program. Moreover, such representations may become a potential source of new forms of human rights, ethics, politics, and legality in the age of drone warfare. The militarization of drones is concomitant with the unmanning of the implements of state violence. Responding to contemporary developments in the modalities assumed by state violence, this paper offers a transnational critique of drone warfare. American drone program is an extension of American imperialism. The resistance against and cultural critique of an empire strengthened by drone strikes demands a fresh mode of reading drones. Theoretical and critical readings of literary texts may expose a unique set of problems regarding human rights and drone strikes. With their naive claim to objective truth, statistical representations fail to capture the humanist reaction to drones. Mere calculus does not animate the gravity and complexity of the situation the weaponized drones create for the victims on the sites of strikes, as well as for the operators working from the control rooms. The paper contributes to and extends the discussion on human rights, literature, and culture initiated by the series Palgrave Studies in Literature, Culture, and Human Rights. Alexandra Moore and Pinto, in their edited book, Writing Beyond the State, published in 2020, argue, quote, the creative forms and representational practices might generate alternative human rights, social imaginaries for our collective present and future, unquote. They further argue, quote, rights are constructed through not just political systems, but through narrative, through culture, and through representation, unquote. I privilege narrative, culture, and representation as potential imaginaries to reflect on rights as they become under limelight with the multiplicity of drones. The literary and cultural critics, therefore, should engage in experimental readings of visual arts, films, drama, literature, and performing art to reflect on various forms of violence unleashed by drones. Additionally, when Moore and Pinto address, quote unquote, the impossibility of statist discourse in human rights studies, one can argue that the drone discourse becomes a logical ally of human rights discourse. Although weaponized drones are directed and controlled by the state actors, their operationalization is enabled in such a way that they elude those states' human rights responsibilities and obligations due to the bureaucratization of the drone strikes. Like all missile attacks, drone strikes are transnational operations. What is special about drone strikes is that Their operators are stationed thousands of miles away from the target, effectively outside the battlefield and beyond the conflict zone. Excuse me. However, the operators can view the potential target distantly, track and attack it from the safety of their homeland. Drone operators can switch between two worlds, two landscapes, and two imaginaries almost at will and as frequently as they wish. Extending Moore and Pinto's arguments, I mobilize Agamben's notion of the state of exception as a conceptual framework within which to situate the cultural critique of drones. In Beyond Human Rights, Agamben argues that the state of exception provides proper context to human rights. Individuals invoke human rights when the state withdraws its protections and pushes the individuals into a legal void. Agamben's conceptualization of human rights as a non-state category provides a framework to address the question of rights with special reference to drone victims. Reading the culture representation of drones in a non-state or beyond state context will enable reflection over the political, legal, and ethical debates as they underpin the discourse of human rights. The relationship between human rights and literature has gained more currency in the last decade. Sophia and Moore in Routledge Companion to Literature and Human Rights, published in 2016, merged the field of human rights and cultural representations. Especially relevant for my paper is Sophia and Moore's attention to, quote unquote, the circumstances rather than facts in unraveling narratives about human rights. This is important for drone strikes as they are deeply intertwined with circumstances. That is, the narrow focus on and limited sight of the strikes allow us to imagine the circumstances that surround the victim. The circumstances become the raw material for the culture representation. And this is how drones are so different from the large-scale wars. The latter are too destructive to preserve the circumstances of the victims. However, drone strikes take place amid everyday life. They let the people, the media, society at large, and civil rights activists witness the termination and cremation of the alive victims on the ground. From that perspective, drone strikes entail the vivid images, which in turn enable humanists as well as literary and cultural critics to register the stories and read them from various ends. Sophia and Moore argue, quote unquote, the stories we tell ourselves as readers or practitioners necessitate critical reading practices that lie at the heart of the humanities and of literary scholarship. The foregoing perspective generalizes. The foregoing perspective generalizes critical reading practice to a kind of critical thinking available in most humanities and social sciences disciplines. In contrast, my paper embraces Edward Said's contrapuntal model of critical reading to analyze the cultural representations of drones. I argue that connecting the cultural representation of drones with human rights is a contrapuntal work. Said explains contrapuntal reading in these words. These are famous words from Cultural Imperialism, page 318. Instead of the imperial analysis offered by the various national or systematically theoretical schools, I have been proposing the contrapuntal lines of a global analysis in which texts and worldly institutions are seen working together. But this global contrapuntal analysis should be modeled not on a symphony, but rather on an atonal ensemble. So the quote ends, this contrapuntal reading model facilitates the analysis I am proposing here. Drones as images of violence tend to be too disconnected from cultural debates. They seem to be inert and immune to culture. They are too technological, too gigantic, too powerful, and too secretive to allow any critique. Therefore, the empire that they enable is too invincible to allow any resistance. However, it is precisely because of this apparent invincibility of the drones that we scholars need to oppose them in the cultural domain. This paper is a step towards that goal. To conclude, I propose critical reading practices which establish a tonal relationship between drone violence and its cultural representations. The categories of drone violence such readings can analyze include technopolitical control, torture, racialized killing, trauma, dehumanization of the target, gendering and other of the enemy, militarized surveillance, constriction of freedom, and subversion of culture. The literary and cultural critics may connect these forms of drone violence with narratives and plays, films and seasons, memoirs and archives, performing art, short videos and visual art, drone performance and drone art. The contrapuntal readings may shed light on the violence which otherwise remains concealed in the entertainment, catharsis, and suspense most of culture representations supposedly provide to the general audience. These productive readings can thus address a fundamental problem of the human rights work. That is, to recognize the violations of the human under the steady rise and gradual normalization of weaponized drones. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so very much, Dr. Waqar, for your presentation. And it really has evoked a lot of thoughts, a lot of questions in our minds. We'll take the questions at the end. And now we'll request Ms. Shazia Aziz from ComScience University, Islamabad, to present a paper which is co-authored with Dr. Akifa Imtiaz and Dr. Sarwat Rasool. And the title of their paper is Cyber Feminism and Public Reactions, a feminist post-structuralist discourse analysis. So over to you now, Ms. Shazia Aziz.
Okay, thank you. This is a feministic post-structuralist discourse analysis of comments on a sarcastic feminist post on social media. It was posted in a group that was composed of readers of Mumtaz Mufti, called Mumtaz Mufti Group. The advertisements included gender stereotyped expectations as required for a male candidate for marriage, which are otherwise expected of a female candidate in the Pakistani society. Denotative and connotative analysis of the data for tracing multiple discourses employed by the participants for gender positioning through discourse was carried out. So you might be familiar with the post. It was very viral those days on social media, but I have pasted it so that it is relatable. So it was posted by a female group member looking for a proposal. I have a friend who is looking for a rishta. She is 32, highly qualified with a postgraduate degree, a 6-figure salary, and financially secure with her own house in the Greater Toronto area. She is looking for a 22, 23-year-old man, ideally from Pakistan, someone she can control and mold into what works for her, you know. She would like him to come from an amazing family, obviously, be tall, buff, with no receding hairline or have a belly, and that perfect shade of wheatish that we all adore. Ideally, she is looking for a cross between Imad Irfani and Hamza Ali Abbasi. He needs to be willing to be a trophy husband, support her in her work, have some level of salika, know at least 5 to 6 basic Pakistani dishes. The rest he can learn from his mother-in-law. We are not totally unreasonable. Be totally okay with her regulating his relationships with his family and integrating with hers. He should be grateful at all times and be expected to produce one son at least. If anyone knows someone like that, leave a link to his resume and we will review it to see if he qualifies. Digestible? Feel how it feels. the other way around. So this was the post, and the purpose behind studying the comments on this post was to see how are competing discourses used for gender representation and positioning in the comments in response to the post. What are the multiple voices and discourses in the data, and what do they imply? Do the data refer to more than one side of the issue, or what does the data reflect about the gender positioning in the society? So findings were that the comments by both female and male participants of the discussion were reflective of 4 significant types of competing discourses by both sides, namely feminist discourse, discourse of masculinity, sarcastic resentment, and sermonizing discourse, irrespective of their own sexual categorization. So all sorts of discourses were posted from both sides of the gender, both genders actually. Here are some examples of the feminist type discourse. F stands for female participants and M for the males. Yaar, tell you honestly, मेरा तो end तक पढ़ते पढ़ते दिमाग ही घूम गया था. But yes, this is harsh reality of our society. The rest were from the male members. Classic feminist rant. True, this is reality of today's society. Wow, classical depiction to make people realize that how do they offense when we look for pride. Just concentrate, feel the bitter truth hidden in the last line, last sentence. Amazingly beautiful post. जी आखिरी लाइन पर गौर करने पर अंदाजा हुआ कि लड़के वाले रिश्ता ढूंढते वक्त कितने डिमांडिंग होते हैं. Agreed. Discourse of masculinity. Tazheek Ame's planted post. It was commented by a male member, derogatory planted post. Instead of such long explanation, there should be just one line. I need a model with remote control. And then a smiley. Fucking useless demands. Sarcastic resentment. Husband ya mulazim? I am disqualified on all counts. Ho gaya rishta fir bas. इससे अच्छा बंदा गोरी फंसा ले. It means they are ready to do those chores for a gori bride than to do it for a desi bride. Born in Pakistan, नौकर चाहिए. Try to get a robot who can talk and obey all orders. मतलब शौहर नहीं गुलाम चाहिए मुहतरमा को. बाजी को शौहर चाहिए या बीवी. Now this was from a sorry. This was from a female. What a man she needs. I assure she will find in Pakistan easily. Then it was in Urdu. 5 साल बाद जब खातून का रिश्ता नहीं मिला तो लड़के की उम्र हद बढ़ाकर 27 से 30 कर दी जाएगी और शक्ल सूरत की हद हमजा अली अब्बासी और हमाद इरफानी से खत्म करके लियाकत आमिर लियाकत और जमीर लोटन जाफरी की दरमियानी हद मुकर्रर कर दी जाएगी, जो खाना भी अच्छा बना सकता हो और झूठे किस्से कहानियां भी अपने पास से खूब बना सकता हो. मजीद 5 सालों बाद रिश्ता ना मिलने पर जहनी दबाव का शिकार होकर वो लड़की या उसके माँ बाप नेपाल में जाकर खुदकुशी कर लेंगे. And this was from a female. बेमकसद post. Then it was a sermonizing sort of discourse by one male only. एक अच्छा मुआशरा बनाने के लिए एक अच्छा घर बनाना जरूरी है और उसके लिए खातून खाना और साहिब खाना में कुछ खसूसियात होना जरूरी है. This is not about digestible. दोनों में अलग अलग खूबियों का होना जरूरी है. खातून खाना को घर बनाना आता हो, साहिब खाना को चलाना आना चाहिए. औरत घर की नौकरानी नहीं, लेकिन अगर उसको घर की सफाई का ख्याल रखना और खाना बनाना आता हो तो ये अच्छी बीवी की खूबी है. इसी तरह शौहर ATM मशीन नहीं है, लेकिन अगर वो बीवी का नान नफका अदा करेगा और घर के सारे जरूरी खर्च उठाएगा तो वो एक अच्छा और मिसाली शौहर होगा. और इस बिना पर इस पोस्ट से इख्तलाफ है. So he strictly believes in strict gender binaries. So conclusion was that feminism has been misunderstood by some men and women, and hence it is facing resistance from those who are accustomed to stereotypical gender roles assigned by the Pakistani society. However, at the same time, there were participants among both genders who responded appreciatingly, which is a good sign of change that is slowly coming in people's perception and blurring the gender for bringing small-scale localized changes in the perceptions of people regarding the definition and actual causes of feminism. Thank you. That was it.
Thank you very much, and we thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. And I'm sure you would have censored some of the more obscene comments, because these days we are used to also seeing such comments. But probably
Yes,
this,
of course.
yeah, okay. So thank you very much for this enlightening presentation, and I'm sure we'll get back to it in our discussion time. And with this, I would now request Ms. Azka Zia, and she's also part of our Digital Humanities group, and she's presenting her paper on Literary Resistance in the Age of Surveillance, a critical speculative study. Over to you, Azka. You may please press the button which is at the bottom where you see 70% written, the button on the left. If you click it, then this slide will be magnified. Yeah, this one.
Thank you so much, sir. I'll start with my presentation. My topic is literary resistance in the age of big data and surveillance, a critical speculative study. We see that the advent of artificial intelligence is considered to be the most important development of our age. Like every other phenomenon which is being readjusted according to AI principles, literature too is being reimagined in this context. While globally, artificial intelligence is being utilized to create literature and imaginative works of verbal art, the literature and humanities departments in Pakistan have not started to engage with this concept yet. This research paper aims to reach beyond the relationship of literature and artificial intelligence and attempts to explicate how literature addresses the challenges of dataism, digital imperialism, and mass surveillance, and most importantly, how literature can help us rethink our future through the transformed modes of literary creations in upcoming cybernetic age, where artificial superintelligence will take over human intelligence. This paper will incorporate a parallel analysis of John Pfeffer's 2018 publication Flinterlands and an AI-generated text One on the Road as a case study to analyze the true nature of artificial intelligence to speculate whether it will resist or reinforce the operations on humanity afflicted through AI by the power structures behind it. These algorithms we deal today now colonize every facet of our life, from driving cars, recognizing iris of the eye, to perfectly translating languages and becoming personal assistants. Not even creativity, a particular human faculty, is out of its reach. In her interview with Anthony Cavod, Nadira Azermai talked about her company Scriptbook, whose mission is to democratize the business of storytelling through the art of artificial intelligence. She claims that within 5 years we will have scripts written by artificial intelligence that you would think are better than human writing. Quote unquote. It is these and similar over-enthusiastic claims that need critical scrutiny. However, the creation of a literary text, as demonstrated by Suman Gupta, the creation of a literary text is understood as an emanation from existing discourse formations, a socio-political ethos, a historical period, modes of book production, circulation, and so on. Each concept mentioned in this definition is multi-layered, and each layer is laced with complex network of interacting human desires, purposes, and causes. Therefore, it is hard to imagine that such complex functions could ever be delegated to the automated autonomy of an artificial intelligence engine. The problem with these over-enthusiastic claims is that it takes a very static view of a literary work as a finished product and as a finished product read and enjoyed. However, such views ignores that the multifaceted dimensions of literature which enter into the process of literary creation. The question here is, can machines replace authors? And in an AI-governed world, where even things would be connected to the servers, will the authors become redundant? Only by feeding large amounts of data to sophisticated algorithms would we be able to create literary text to instruct and offer pleasure. In an article, artificial intelligence can never truly be intelligent. Mohana Das also claims that what is being called intelligence is actually not intelligence. By citing a Chinese room argument, he highlights the difference between the truly intelligent and being able to do certain things by following provided instructions. Das is of the opinion that it is not really the intelligence that you and I identify intrinsically as a trait of our species. It is but an imitation or an illusion of human intelligence. Applying this insight onto the question regarding the death of the author, or will AI replace human creativity and intelligence, we might reiterate that an AI-based composition cannot be called literature in the sense defined above, and thus algorithms responsible for its creation cannot perform the function of a human author who has the capacity to answer the question of why one would write a certain text. This question of why is what an algorithm may never answer. It is worth noting that technology and these algorithms are not very free. Whoever controls the algorithms controls its products, and hence greater production and access to data leads to greater control, marking an age of digital imperialism. An additional challenge is that AI can obscure asymmetrical power relationships in a way that it makes difficult for the literary critics and the concerned developers of the AI to meaningfully address this issue during the developmental process. As Roha Benjamin notes that whereas in the previous era the intention to deepen the racial inequities were more explicit, today coded inequities is perpetuated precisely because those who design and adopt such tools are not thinking carefully about the systemic racism. Safia Noble, in her book Algorithms of Oppression, supports this concept that how algorithms reinforce these oppressions on already oppressed races and minorities. And she goes on to say that we now face a new era framed by what I call technological redlining, the way data is used to profile us. We have new models where financial institutions are looking at our social networks to make decisions about it. Shoshana Zuboff, The Age of Artificial Capitalism and Weller's Technology and the Virtues can also
Please
be
allow
read.
me to intervene, Asta. You've already consumed some time, although you still have a few minutes left, but you haven't talked about your analysis. You are still on theory. Would you be talking about the splinterlands as well?
Yes, sir. And
So
then we
can you
come to
please
that.
move on to that part? You just
The
have
most,
3 to 4 minutes, 3 minutes.
yes, sir. The most dominant genre that has tried to address the concerns of an uncertain future is speculative fiction. One can see a clear difference in the way various themes pertaining to humanity's future are addressed in speculative fiction. This paper draws its conclusions based on the 2018 novel Splinterlands that portrays a dystopian human future where surveillance is normalized, making it an inevitable part of
Can
life.
we see some other slide as well?
But somehow the PPT is not working.
No, you can click on the left, the panel that you have on your left. If you click on the slide there, second or third. No? Okay, carry on.
In the world of Splinterlands, public and private spaces have both been transformed into sophisticated code spaces, where individuals are intermittently surveilled by one single entity that is CRISPR International. And surveillance is such common phenomena in that world that the public is really not alarmed at it anymore, as the protagonist Julian West casually reiterates that he should have anticipated surveillance while he was on a virtual trip to meet his family. And the agents of CRISPR International proudly declare that you don't get it, do you? We know everything about you, everything, all your little secrets. Here, Safar not only hints on this normalized fashion of mass surveillance, but also he boldly points out the Western fashions of making money out of people's suffering. While Julian West is on his trip to his elder son, he is baffled as his son declares the monetary gains by making things is old-fashioned way, and there always has been enormous profit in large-scale suffering. His Pfeffer is implying the fact that how West has made this way of making money out of people suffering normalized, and this is how we see our future world. In short, Splinterlands hints at the possible dangers of humans becoming a measurable type and a data object, while becoming so, human race becomes the victims of mass surveillance, algorithmic tyranny, and digital imperialism. In this algorithmic state, Pfeffer defines human subjects as measurable types, data templates that offer interpretation of the world, assign individual identities, and frequently determine the discursive parameters of who we can and we cannot be. In such a state, there remains a need of decolonial approaches in speculative fiction, as explored by Julia Saipak in The Dimension of Decolonial Future in Contemporary Indigenous Speculative Fictions, which elucidate that both utopian and dystopian futures about indigenous future and argues that the decolonial project in speculative fiction is not merely restricted to presenting a utopian future, rather it also deals with apocalyptic and dystopian future as a way of mobilizing native resistance against new colonial ideologies that operates in the form of artificial intelligence. Concluding the paper has highlighted the need to critically examine the narratives that compete in the discourse pertaining to the humanities' future. Here again, the biases of new colonial world are being perpetuated. On one hand, the technocentric biases, as we see in the novel, infect every deep neural network of AI, and on the other hand, Oriental prejudices continue to taint the speculative fiction and muffle the already marginalized voice of indigenous communities of global south. In such a scenario where algorithms continue to reinvent pre-digital defects of human thought, it becomes all more important for humanities researchers, writers, and artists to cultivate a techno-moral wisdom that will lead and might pave a path for a more human future. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Aska, for presenting this paper, although we would have wished that you would have shown us other slides as well. But we'll have a few questions for you in the end. I hope that we'll have quite some time for discussion. And with this, I hope I'm not skipping anyone. So do we have Rida Shahid with us?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
All right. So we have a paper entitled Post-Human National Identities and Economic Upheaval, a critical study of John Pfeffer's dystopian novel, Splinterlands. So Splinterlands once again. And I would also like to mention it's an omission here in the program. The paper is also co-authored by Sadia Salim. So Rida Shahid and Sadia have worked on it together. So, but Sadia's name is missing. So over to you, Rida.
Morning, everyone. My name is Rita, and first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Azhar for accepting my paper and SHAHZEB for making me able to present at international conference. It is my first presentation at this conference.
Rida, just a second, please hold on. I think, do you have some extra mic with you? Because there's a lot of distortion, or probably you should move closer to your laptop, or you may use some other mic or hands-free or something of the sort. So let's try to make the voice better.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, it's much better now.
Is it better?
Yeah.
Okay. So let me start again. My name is Rida Shahid, and first of all, I would like to thank Dr. Raza for accepting my paper and letting me present at an international conference. And I would also like to thank Sir SHAHZEB for his constant mentoring that made me able to present now, and my co-author, Sadia Salim, for her support and knowledge. So my topic is, as mentioned by Dr. Shahzeb, is post-human national identities and economic upheaval, a critical study through John Pfeffer's dystopian novel Splinterlands. In my research, I have addressed this question, that what will be the future of identity and what will be the things that will aid in the emergence of these new identities. And for this research, I have used a fictional novel, which is a dystopian representation of the year 2050 of this world, written by John Pfeffer. So we have often heard this saying that if you are not paying for the product you are using, then you are the product. This saying is proving itself right as we are entering into the post-human age from early 21st century, where technology became a major need of our everyday life, and social networking websites came into existence. These networking sites later became a hub for the collection of data of its users' activities. Why this data was being collected came into the discussion when there was a US election in 2016, and the role of Facebook was first discussed in that election, that how it is tempering it. The future of identities and economy is dependent upon the data that is collected. In the present times, the most data is collected through social media websites, where people are actively participating and becoming addicted to them without realizing that they are using these websites at the cost of themselves. For the human beings becoming more and more less humans and more consumers, it is inevitable conclusion that the identity of human is dependent upon the capacity to buy the product, and thus it also decides about the future of economy. Harari, in his book 21 Lessons of 21st Century, also claims that those who own the data owns the future. According to him, the whole narrative of human civilization going towards equality is an illusion. He says, and I quote, "In last few decades, people all over the world were told that humankind is on the path to equality and that the globalization and new technology will help us get there sooner. In reality, the 21st century might create most unequal societies in history. Though globalization and internet bridge the gap between the countries, they threaten to enlarge the rift between classes, and just as humankind seems to about to achieve global unification, the species itself might divide into biological caste." We have seen that the pandemic of 2019 is still taking over the economy of the world. We can see that how technology has become the part of those fields where it was not used that much up till now. We have entered into the third decade of 21st century, which also means that we are already in the post-human age. In his novel, John Pfeffer made many predictions about post-human world. The novel was published in the year 2016, and interestingly, it is set in the year 2050, and the protagonist is narrating the disaster of the year 22. There are many occasions in the novel where he is telling about the difficulties he faced because of being ineligible to live in the post-human era. He talks about being technologically dependent and less aware about his family, even with the world that has become one global village. His conversations with all of his family members gives us a critique on how the world has become so small, but the distances between relationships have extended. He also explains that how behaviors are controlled through technology, and it is the data that is being collected will decide who will survive when the disaster, sorry, when the big disasters will hit the earth. In my research, I have mentioned that how these consumer-centric identities will allow the service providers to choose their preferences when the time will come. For example, Julian West, who is the narrator in the novel and the protagonist, says that during the Hurricane Donald, when people were looking at the government for rescue, the government stepped back saying that it is the act of God and they cannot do anything about it, while the private agencies were promising the survival of people at the highest cost. Here I want to conclude, as my paper is my presentation is not very long, this novel, Sprinterlands, is more like a warning for the people who are not understanding the effects of the age of technology, its relation to the economy and emerging national identities. These identities based on technology-dependent consumer market will play major role in the shifting of the economic powers in the post-human age, which in fact is not very far away, as we have seen that China is already becoming an economic power of the world. And another example is us depending on the technology in the age of COVID-19 and what will happen in the post-COVID age. However, Pfeffer's cure to the splinter lands that he's talking about in his novel is very simple, and that is back to basics to save the world from big natural disasters and economic upheaval. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rida, for presenting your paper on this intriguing novel. And you've highlighted that we need to perhaps begin to ponder over such questions, how the future will unfold. And I think that this session is a testimony of the fact that most of us or all of us have started thinking about these questions. So with this, we move on to our final paper, another paper with a very intriguing title. We have with us Ms. Maria Asif from University of Management and Technology, Lahore, and she would be presenting her paper on, and by the way, sorry, I forgot that Rida is also affiliated as a graduate student, as an MPhil student with FCCU. So now we have artificial intelligence vis-a-vis gender equality, impact and impediments. So over to you, Maria Asif. I hope you are with us. I'm sorry, it's Myra Asif.
Thank you, sir. Yes, this is Myra, and I'm unable to share my screen because the internet is not that strong here. So I'll just be sharing my slides. I hope you all can see them. So my paper essentially talks about how artificial intelligence and gender equality are related to each other. While I was doing my research on this topic, what I noted was that a lot of the data a lot of the work that feminists have done, or a lot of the work that the general public has done on gender equality and AI is very negative in its connotation. It's always looking at how there's this dystopian world that will be brought upon if AI gets super involved in our everyday lives and everything. And while there's some truth to it, there are multiple sides to this relationship, and this is what this paper actually explores. What this paper does is it uses the feminist theories of technology in the future, which emphasize the mutual shaping of gender and technology, with technology being seen as both a source and the result of gender relations. It contends that gender and technology relationship is fluid and situational. Essentially, what this paper makes you see is different perspectives. How AI is replicating or creating gendered relations in this world, and how the already existing gender relations impact artificial intelligence. Let us explore this a little bit more. The first question was, why does AI matter to gender equality? Now you have to understand is that artificial intelligence cannot produce new knowledge, right? AI is essentially replicates existing knowledge. The goal of AI is to take data from the past and to make predictions for the future based on that data. It tries to imitate the human brain by making it seem like, by making decisions based on that data. So since that data is inputted by human beings, and since that data is collected by human beings, and human beings are very much capable of prejudice, that data itself can be biased. And since AI doesn't really understand the subtleties of human nature or human culture, it ends up replicating those biases. And because of that, gender biases are reproduced by artificial intelligence and its decisions. So AI matters to gender equality in a way that is primarily focused on the data that is fed to the AI. The results depend on, finally, who codes the machine and how it is coded. And so the questions that we need to ask are not that if AI is a dystopian technology, is whether will the developers who are working on AI take gender differences into consideration? Will they try to counter them? It's the developers who have to be conscious of the gender bias in technology, because technology itself is a tool. It's how we wield it that matters. Because I am using the feminist and theories of technology in future, I would give a brief introduction of the framework. What feminist scholars do in their theories of technology is that they expose the underlying sexism, androcentrism, and capitalist vagarism, which encompasses the production, consumption, and evolution of technology. This is the negative stuff that I was talking about, that they expose this stuff about technology, but they also show that technology has this potential for female and gendered agency that was not existing before. So there are two sides to the coin. What is the most significant contribution, however, is that they point out that women and gendered minorities have historically been barred from STEM, and because they have been barred from STEM, two major hurdles have contemporary hurdles have risen. The first one is that most of the developers in STEM are male, and obviously all of us are prone to prejudice, right? So when men are the only ones who are coding these machines, there's bound to be some bias that will go through these machines. So there needs those developers need to be diversified so that there are multiple voices and that bias can be controlled and prevented. And the second thing is the data itself. Women and gendered minorities have been largely absent from the public spaces. Because they have been absent from the public spaces, there is not much data about them, apart from the very recent data that we have gathered because of technology. So because the data about these people is non-existing, the data sets that AI uses are skewed. AI has most data sets that are predominantly about men. Because of this, the decisions that the AI makes are essentially the decisions that were initially being made in the human world for the benefit and the circumstances that were related to the male gender. And because of that, these decisions are not essentially what are probably the most beneficial for women and gendered minorities. Some of the things that feminist scholars have pointed out are the facial recognition systems, which claim that they can find the sexual identity through just the face of a person, or the linguistic stereotypes. When Google Translate translates something, it immediately sticks to binary genders to it. And the medical failure, which is that there's a lack of information about female body, especially Black women's bodies, and there's lack of data, because of which very real people suffer. So I look at the data that has been provided by a think tank in the US. What they do is that they analyze about 59 AI based systems, and they conclude that 70% of these systems have a gender bias. Because of this gender bias, poor quality service is given to women and non-binary people. One of the examples that is makes this pretty clear is that, for example, when banks have to give credit-based loans to women, AI systems showed a tendency to deny the loan request of women and gendered minorities. The reason being, they looked at the past data and found that women were never really given the loans. Most of their requests were denied. Now, we understand that culturally, women were not given the loans because they didn't really have job security. So banks initially didn't really trust women with loans. So their requests were largely denied. However, that is not the case now. Women do have some form of job security. But since AI is relying on past historical data and it doesn't really understand the cultural sensitivities of that data, it is still reproducing the same sexist decisions which affect the lives of women today. So, to prevent such a relapse in sexism, it is very important for AI developers to be gender sensitive and to diversify those developers so that they can make that data gender sensitive. It is the data that we have to work on. It is not the system in itself. It's not AI in itself that is the devil. Now, I've presented to you one part of the equation that says about what the impact of AI is on art, on the world. The second part of the equation is what is the impacts of us on AI. One of it we have seen is that we are the ones who code AI. We are the ones who provided the data to actually work. So there's that. However, there's another interesting thing that's going on. Human beings have this desire to gender everything that they see. So even objects in different languages have different genders. We instantly, whenever we see someone, we are like, oh, is this a male or a female? And we notice it by their physical characteristics, their behaviors, their voice, and things like that. So this same tendency to personify others has sort of transferred to AI and robots. So what was seen is that since nursing homes in Western societies are using AI robots, the nurses noted that people use pronouns such as he or she to address those robots. And when they were asked, why are you using a gendered pronoun instead of it for that robot, because that's a thing, they said that because it has a very high pitched voice, it seems like a woman or a female, that is why it's a she, or because it has very broad shoulders and it has a very broad frame, it is a he. So human beings have been gendering AI through their gaze, and that is super important to feminists because the gendering that is being done is very binary. It's very divided into the women and male constricted binary opposition system that the feminist scholars have been trying to disprove that gender is fluid. It's not just two binary genders, there's an entire spectrum. But because of this gendering of objects, that system seems to start replicating itself again. Finally, there are some recommendations on how the industry can prevent AI from falling into the trap of becoming something that will relapse sexism in the world. The first and foremost thing is you have to ensure that there are diverse and multidisciplinary teams working on these systems. You have to make sure that there is an ethical system that is coded into AI. AI needs ethical and legal frameworks. They're very much lacking right now because the technology is rapidly evolving and the laws cannot keep up with it. The data set needs to be responsibly developed. As we have seen, data sets are literally the most significant thing that is contributing to this disaster. So we have to create tools to make sure that data sets are gender sensitive. You have to establish policies and practices that enable representative, responsible algorithm development. You have to establish corporate governance for responsible AI and end-to-end internal policies to mitigate bias. You have to engage CSR to advance responsible and ethical AI and larger systems, meaning that the industry itself, the entire industry itself needs to come together and say that this is important. If your system is gender biased and if your system does not have any countermeasures to prevent gender bias, we are not using your AI technology. You have to force those developers to actually take this into consideration. And finally, How can society change this scenario? Simply make sure more women and gender minorities are trained in STEM fields, encourage more women and gender minorities to explore STEM and explore their passion for science and technology and so on. Equal access to technology for all genders is the solution to preventing this sort of dystopian disaster that we are seeing in banks and credit loan industries, where gender differences are sort of being brought back because of AI decisions. This is my paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Ms. Myra Asif, and it was really very enlightening, and we were able to know a lot about AI biases, and this gender bias is indeed very important. And as you aptly highlighted, these are biases which exist in society and which are then reflected within AI systems as well. So a lot is being done these days on AI ethics, and I'm really very glad that from within the domain of arts and humanities, there were so many papers which were presented and which are looking at digital humanities and artificial intelligence, and even drones, which are of course also operated. There's a lot of AI involved there. So we still have quite some time for question and answers and discussion. First of all, the questions that were asked, I'm going to put those questions to presenters. And after that, if we still have time, I think that we may have a brief discussion about some of the matters that you may highlight. And then finally, I would be concluding the session. Now, the first question that was raised at 10:45 a.m. was by Ms. Shazia Aziz, and the question is from Dr. Waqar Azim. And the question is, don't you think the veto power given to a few powers in the UN, where people can raise voice against drones and the like, itself is a violation of human rights? And this should be debated about first. So, Dr. Waqar.
Yeah, Professor Shazia, yes, absolutely, that is true. But I would also say this is not, matter of priority. I would say that simultaneous debates have to take place. Okay, so it depends on the context. The context of the debate, right? So definitely there is a context of UNO where debates of the kind which you are referring to must take place, right? But then there are some academic debates as well. And then within academics, there are cultural and critical and theoretical debates as well. And that is what we are trying to take care of, right? So yes, I totally agree that this, matter of hegemonic, veto power that certain countries have, that should also be challenged and must be debated. Thank
I
you
would like to briefly add here that, for instance, okay, Waqar, I think you will have to mute your mic. So I'd like to add here that this international politics has to exist within existing structures. And United Nations Security Council is one existing structure which is there. Now, I would like to draw a parallel which might be relevant here, that even in the domain of literary humanities or theory or arts and humanities, here again, we have existing structures, existing paradigms. And most of the times, we work within those paradigms. I think, since there are many scholars here, I think that we have to deal with those paradigms as well. For instance, the way we've brought about this change in the existing structure of academics, I would say scholars from the global south, the way they've started addressing questions of paradigms, questions of epistemologies, and this decoloniality project is basically about that. Now, similarly, we have these existing structures, physical structures like the UN or, of course, the Security Council, which predate whatever we do beneath those structures. So I think that the debate has begun, and what Walter Mignolo calls colonial matrix of power. So colonial matrix of power is one such structure which addresses both discursive and non-discursive structures and paradigms which exist and which obstruct the way we think about matters which are found around us. Anyway, so we have another question which is again addressed to Dr. Waqar, and it comes from Zakir Ahmed. And the question is, Dr. Waqar, you use the term Islamic terrorism. Is that meant the current group of Taliban in Afghanistan? Do you also refer to them as, or when you use the word Islamic terrorism, what was in your mind?
Okay, Zakir, thanks for the question. I really can't say yes or no to this question, but I do want to clarify that I use this term from the perspective of the US government of that time, 2001 onwards, right? Which characterized certain populations as representative of a kind of terrorism they called Islamic terrorism. Okay, I may not agree with this qualification or this nomenclature, right? So it was from their perspective that they were tracking certain terrorists, which they called Islamic terrorists. And, it's well known that drones were, specifically deployed to track the terrorists of this kind. I mean, there could have been other possibilities as well, but historically, probably the most important victim or targets that the US had in mind were the, people or individual the US characterized as Islamic terrorists, right? So it is from the perspective of the US, that I use this term Islamic terrorists.
Okay, so we have a question from Faiza Anam, and the question is from Bahadur Ali. My question is to Ma'am Faiza, as you have explained about the concept of two-way traffic in the book Get a Life. So my question to you is, what is your opinion about this two-way traffic? Do you think science is from literature and literature is from science?
Okay, so I do endorse this idea of a working model, two-way traffic between science and literature, as this is what I've argued in my paper, that literature simultaneously sources and resources science. And we do see this sort of conceptualization of this idea in Get a Life as well, as Gadamer has made use of scientific discourse in her book to depict the journey of Paul Benjamin through the crisis that he went through in the quarantine. Likewise, I think Paul's visual voyage through the quarantine may be used by scientists to deal with this current crisis that we have at the moment. And apart from that, there are multiple references. If you look at the history of literature and the history of science as well, there are other references as well where we see that literature has been a source for sciences and vice versa. For example, this popular psychoanalytical theory by Freud, it has its origin in Oedipus Rex. So he took this idea from a literary book primarily, and then he explored it and expanded it into a psychological theory. So I think I do endorse this particular model of two-way traffic, where we should not look at these two disciplines as divorced from each other. They are connected because, as I mentioned earlier as well, that the areas of inquiry that we have in sciences and in literature, they're pretty much the same. Both the disciplines, they center the inquiry around human existence, human evolution, and human survival. I hope it answered the question, Babar.
All right, and with this, we have one final question from Dr. Waqar Azim once again. And the question is from Muhammad Ishaq. It was worth listening to you, Dr. Waqar Azim. My question is how resistance through literature will have impact on the human right abuses happening around the world?
Okay, Muhammad Ishaq, thank you. This is the question. This is the very question, in fact, that I am, struggling with through this paper. Okay, so basically, what as literary critics or culture critics, what we aim for is to study the imaginary of any concept, right? So we have a concept as it is established. One can read about it, understand it, but then there is a futurity of that concept as well, or futurism of that concept as well, which is its imaginary. That is something which makes changes in that concept possible. Now, your question, how literature can have impact on the human rights abuses, right? So basically what I'm trying to name up, and many other people, in fact, all of us are trying to make possible, is this, that the literary and cultural representations should be foregrounded in such a manner that they should be offering counter discourses to the hegemonic discourses of the empire. For example, we are well aware of the drone operations, how they work. They work through seeing, through the act of seeing, in such a manner that the act of seeing has been weaponized. So an extraordinary camera fitted with a weapon, that is drone. Now, I'm sure you have seen that famous image, not a bug splat. I have it right now in front of me. As I don't know if the sharing. I think I can quickly probably experiment with it. Right. So I hope you can see this. The installation, not the bug splat. SHAHZEB, can you confirm? Is it visible?
It is visible.
Okay, good. Right. So now this is an artistic representation of the view of the drone from the ground. How would it look like from the bottom, looking upwards, right? Now, the problem is that when drone operator, as the representative of empire, or as a kind of what I often call the colonial administrator, when drone operator looks at the subjects, the targets on the ground, that act of seeing remains concealed from the rest of us. That person is a privileged person. Now, if we want to challenge the rights violation, human rights violation, which are made possible through a drone strike, one way to do that is to make obvious or make visible the consequences of the drone strike. Now, the apparent consequences are that terrorists are killed. We get a news line, terrorists are killed. Sometimes there is a little apology as well. Well, there is a little collateral damage as well. But that news headline does not invoke the discourse of human rights. Why? Because it is up to the empire, up to the drone operator, up to the one who can see from that height, for them to decide what to make visible and what to make invisible. Precisely here is the role of art and literature, to make visible which is concealed by the empire. So the crimes of the empire have to be made visible. And one potential way to bring them in the domain of visibility is literature and art. So when we as critics and writers and theorists of literature and art engage with discussions on literary and cultural representations of imperial crimes, we are precisely making visible what is being, concealed by the imperial operations. That is how the human rights abuses can be made visible, made pronounced, and then challenged. So I hope I
Thank you
answered
very
your
much,
question.
Sukar, for this elaborate answer. And it was really a moving experience for me to look at this image, that how they've tried to interact with the drone pilot who might have been sitting somewhere in Arizona and sipping a cup of coffee and then pressing a button. And based on that, hellfire happens on ground. So how these people on ground, through the image of this child, tried to communicate with that drone pilot that we human beings, we live here. And what you've highlighted, that through literature, then we must highlight these crimes of the empire. I think that's a very crucial point. And it also connects with the very first paper, very first slide, in which Zafra talked about pervasiveness of imperial ideologies and how writers somehow try to present an alternative or indigenous version of that. Now we'll take another question, and this is addressed to Myra, and this comes from Arish Maroof, and she says, my question, but human beings are gendering these robots for certain other reasons, such as selling them for sexual partners to their customers. What do you think about this dimension, as it also raises a kind of social and moral dilemma? Do you also consider doing these things as gender bias? Myra?
Um, yeah. So this is actually a very good question, because the sex robot industry is one of the biggest industries that is catering to AI robots. It is actually one of the biggest industries that has this, that is fastly replicating the human skin, the human eyes, and making the robots look more human-like, which was not something that was being done by the medical industry or others, because they were preferring service over looks, and these are the ones who are actually catering to the visual of the human being that didn't exist before. So I do think that this industry, this pornography industry that is catering to fetishes, is actually replicating the gender biases. How the gender biases are very much, they are also racial in their nature, because most of these the sex robots are predominantly white. They're predominantly blonde. They're predominantly of the image that used to be of the ideal woman or the ideal man. And then even the body types and the body image and the services that these robots provide are very much the things that real people suffer from. So there is a huge problem in the AI industry regarding these sex robots, but at the same time there is this also perspective that if these robots are made more prevalent than people who have these aggressive desires that they often take out on real people, they might just take out their fetishes on these robots, and real people might be saved the misery from having to live with them. So gendering these robots is actually a two-way thing. In one way it is replicating the gender biases that exist, but in the other way it is also making real people a bit more free from the fetishes that are a bit too deviant for the rest of society to deal with, and it is providing them an outlet that doesn't really hurt anyone. So it is a very complicated topic, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. And I would strongly encourage all presenters to interact with one another. At Punjab University's Institute of English Studies, we are trying to think about these issues. Waqar at FC is working on these issues pertaining to human rights. And at the same time, we had Myra from UMT, who also presented on an excellent topic and enhanced our knowledge about these matters. So I think that, or probably I'll talk about it in the closing session of the conference. Please do join us today in the closing session. Apart from that, I would just give a walkthrough before I would offer final thank yous to all participants and also organizers. In today's session, we first off started with Zafra's paper, and she talked about Indigenous Futurism. And I think that one very important aspect which she highlighted, which I've just mentioned, was this pervasiveness of imperial ideologies. And now we are at a juncture where I think that artificial intelligence and what we call digital dictatorship, we are at the threshold of that. And I think that scholars all over the world are now pondering over matters pertaining to AI imperialism or digital dictatorship. So I think that it's very important to see how writers and how artists are trying to offer resistance of some sort to new forms of oppression. And I think that since things are really very malleable, so the more we work on this and the more ideas of resistance we spread, I think that there is a greater chance of spreading this awareness. Now, so I would say that with that, we moved on to Pfizer's paper, where she talked about literature as a cultural data bank, and she talked about narrative modeling, and she also talked about literature as a fictional thought experiment. I think all of us agree with that. And in fact, a testimony was offered later, as now drone strikes come to an end. Mostly, I think we don't have those drone strikes in that number, but still the work of Waqar Azim, I think that it also becomes that memory, cultural memory, that we know that this all was going on. Now, similarly, Shazia's paper on cyberfeminism and public relations, it also enabled us to see what sort of sarcasm is there. And she highlighted these problems pertaining to gender roles and feminism and being critical of feminism. And literary resistance was the topic of Azka Zia, as she talked about possible future and how literature offers resistance in various forms. So she's working on that area. Once again, Rida also offered us this idea of how future is going to impact us, especially our identities. And finally, Myra presented this paper on gender bias, which still is there despite AI, despite these utopian understanding of what technology is going to do for us. So she talked about sexism and algorithms of oppression. I would end with that phrase, which is also the title of a very important book, which talks about racism and how algorithms perpetuate racism. So with this, our session comes to an end, and at this appropriate time, I think I would also like to thank the conference chair, Professor Dr. Amra Raza. She has been instrumental in holding this conference. It is actually her brainchild, and this is the first ever international virtual conference organized by the Faculty of Arts and Humanities. Otherwise, we've had conferences organized by the departments or institutes, but this is the first ever organized by a faculty, and it has brought together scholars from various disciplines. So thank you very much, Professor Dr. Amra Raza, and if she has a word or two for our presenters, I would welcome her to say a few words.
Thank you very much, SHAHZEB, for chairing this session. It was very, very interesting, a very, very upcoming topic, and I'm glad that we had so many papers relating to this sub-theme in our conference. I can see lots of students, lots of colleagues. So welcome to you all. I hope that we can keep up this connection that we have built up through the conference. And thank you very much. Thank you. It was very informative and very very, very interesting. And I think the recording is going to be available later on as well. Thank you very much, SHAHZEB. Your comments, your summing up was very lucid and very it gave me, although I had to come and go in the session, but it's given me an overview, a comprehensive overview of your session. Thanks a lot, Dr. SHAHZEB.
Thank you very much. So over to you, Sadia, for any final comments or any final instructions as the panel coordinator. And thank you all, and hopefully we'll continue to collaborate on various other scholarly projects within the domain of digital humanities. I would also like to thank Dr. Shiri Rahim. I think that she is with us, and she has been a former teacher. So thank you very much, Dr. Shiri Rahim, for being with us.
Now we will conclude the panel here. I would like to thank the chair for chairing this session and all the participants for participating, all the presenters for participating, and all the attendees for their interest in the conference. The recording of the session will be available and will be emailed to you. Thank you so much, everyone. I would like to end the meeting here. Should I end?
Yes, you can, but please stop recording first.
Okay.